Imagine this. When the sun slipped behind the timbered roofs of a medieval town, it didn't announce rest. It announced jurisdiction, knight's jurisdiction. When law thinned, shadows swelled, and every doorway learned to listen. The first star was less a light than a verdict. Out there, hooves could whisper like knives. Dogs barked at nothing and everything. A bell tolled curfew, and the streets, those narrow throats of stone, held their breath. Now hold that against your evening. You step from a bright kitchen into a hallway that knows your footsteps. A lock answers with a confident click. Outside, streetlights pour neat islands of safety onto asphalt. A phone glows like a tame star in your palm. The hum of a refrigerator is your household guardian. If you need the night, you summon it with a dimmer switch. In the Middle Ages, the night summoned you. It crept under doors, through gaps in shutters, over rooftops slick with dew, and into the mind where imagination became its most faithful accomplice. In the next hour, you'll discover why midnight once felt like a second world layered over the first. We'll walk the lanes where thieves learned the grammar of darkness, where guildsmen feared the knock they wouldn't answer, where a cough behind a wall could be omen, where a spark from a hearth could bloom into a city's nightmare. You'll hear the watchman's clatter and the prayers he muttered under his breath. You'll meet the saints and charms that rode in cloth pouches, the wolves that waited beyond the hedges, and the stories of demons that were less about monsters than about the very human hunger to explain footsteps no one could see. I won't ask you to close your eyes. Keep them open and let the street lose its lamplight. See how the world simplifies in the dark. Door, threshold, road, hedge, sky. Hear the iron latch settle, the distant creak of a cart that shouldn't be moving at this hour, the whisper of a river against the pilings. Smell pitch, damp wool, and bread gone cold. We stand at the edge of a town whose daylight manners have been put to bed. The gate is barred, the torches sputter, the wind carries a rumor. Step softly. The medieval night is awake, and it has been waiting to be heard. When day in a medieval town folded itself away, it didn't vanish. It thinned, like vellum held to a candle. Streets that argued all afternoon with hawkers and carts grew narrow and careful. Doors gave soft, decisive answers as bars slid home. Somewhere beyond the wall, a last cart lurched for the gate, wheels biting into ruts, driver pleading with the watch. The reply was the long creak of timber and a bolt like an iron sentence. Wolves tested the fields with a ragged chorus, not close, but close enough to teach the ear humility. A church bell, half swallowed by fog, gave the hour and a warning in the same breath. Silence was never absolute here. It was a weave of sounds that made the dark legible. Footsteps on cobbles, a latch lifting, the soft complaint of leather, a whispered ave under someone's breath. Smoke did the thinking for many homes. Tallow candles stuttered and left a sour film on the air. Pitch torches coughed resin and sparks. Hearths dulled to a slow red under ash that smelled of oak and yesterday's stew. The night added its own wetness. Damp timber swollen at the joints, wattle walls that exhaled the day's sweat, a lane that remembered where waste was tipped at dusk. Not filth as spectacle, but as background, faint, persistent, like a note you only hear when the melody stops. Step by the river, and the smells change. Cold stone, eel baskets rinsed and stacked, tar sealing a boat's seam, the breath of water that has traveled farther than any villager will. Inside, the world was smaller and more demanding. A bed meant straw that rustled with every shift. A blanket of rough wool that kept most of the chill and kept a little of it too. The cold of stone found the bones and sat with them. A child turned, strings of a mattress creaked, embers answered by settling. Cloth brushes skin, homespun, thick at the seams, smelling faintly of smoke and the body it has known all day. Fingers test a shutter and feel the wind bluffing at the gaps. The latch gives that honest wooden click that says, "For now, enough." In a space this tight, time has texture. Minutes lengthen when the house listens. The pulse of the hearth carries them along. Light did not fill rooms. It perched, wavered, doubted. A single candle carved a bowl of gold out of darkness and left the corners to their own devices. A torch in the lane wrote bright, reckless strokes across a wall and moved on, taking courage with it. In many villages, there was no torch at all. Only moon, if there was a moon, or the dangerous generosity of stars. Without lamps to bully them, the heavens were a crowded script, and more than one traveler swore that the sky itself could read him. Under that sky, a blacksmith's forge cooled with a sigh, and the shape of the anvil became a memory you could trip over. Listen a little closer, and the night unfurls more threads. A hen scolds in her sleep. Pigs shift like stubborn sacks. A dog raises its head, hears a cat's confident negotiation with a fence, and decides the matter is beneath him. In the alley, two neighbors exchange a word they didn't need in daylight. The word floats, small and invaluable, then is gone. Farther off, the watchman makes his round, staff on stone. Tap, 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 announcing presence, warding off what presence can ward. He knows the city as a map of sounds, where the mill wheel nicks the water, where the rope on the well squeals at the same place, night after night, like a child learning to sing. Your world can meet this one without strain. Let your room keep its quiet appliances, its soft rectangle of hallway light, its familiar clock with the conscientious tick. Then invite in a draft that doesn't exist, the scent of pitch catching, the metal taste of a key turned from the outside. A car far away becomes a cart at the wall. The heating pipe contracts and expands. Call it a beam, settling. The refrigerator's hum, if you half forget it, could be a river beyond the town, keeping counsel with the pilings. This is the bridge, not a trick. The way small sounds escort the mind across centuries. The more precisely you hear them, the less you need to be told where you are. Fear here is not spectacle. It is practice. The practice of counting steps between door and hearth without light, of placing boots by feel, of knowing the floorboard that complains and lifting your weight before it tells on you, of remembering to bank the fire so that morning does not begin with ash and regret. Every family keeps its own customs against the night. A sprig by the lintel, a charm stitched into a child's cap, a prayer kept on the tongue and not spoken aloud. Outside, the dark has its customs too. It gathers under carts and in the oxblood of the barn door. It hides in the hinge of the gate and watches patient through a knothole. Past the last cottage, the road is simply a paler stripe of ground, rehearsed by feet, believed in by habit. Hedges become a congregation of black. A pond holds the moon like a coin it will not spend. The wind is a reader of roofs, searching out loose thatch, turning pages with careful, insinuating fingers. If there are wolves tonight, you'll hear them once and then not again, and that second silence will be the one that moves you. If there are men, they'll make themselves into night. Cloak, step, breath, until the watchman's staff or a dog's temper insists on names. And yet in this same darkness lives a slower music. The mill stream keeps its patient count. Somewhere a mother hums, because sound is a path home when light is not. A monk in the priory watches a thin flame gutter and takes it as permission to lay down his pen. The town, for all its fear, is not only afraid, it's also resting in the way it knows how. When the wind drops, the stars seem louder. When a cloud passes, the candle seems braver. The night does not hurry. It outlasts curses and lullabies alike. So we stand here, between shutter and street, with a hand on the latch and the town's breath in our chest. We haven't left our century. We've simply learned how the past sounds when you stop insisting on daylight. Ahead lie the lanes and the rumors they carry, the watch and what they watch for, the human bargains struck after sunset. Step with me, not quickly, not timidly. The dark is thick, but it is legible. And once you know its alphabet, the story begins to speak. Her name was Marjorie Hale, a widow with a narrow shop that smelled of tallow and honey, as though the walls themselves remembered flame. By day, she sold candles to guildsmen and fishermen, to a midwife with kind hands and a miller with flour on his eyebrows. She trimmed wicks and poured wax and counted copper at a table her husband had built before the fever took him. By night, she listened. The shop leaned into the town's main lane like an old friend, its shutter a wooden eyelid that closed with a sigh. Beyond the lane stood the gate, and beyond the gate, the fields. And at the edge of those fields, maybe, if the stories were true, everything that was waiting. Marjorie had lived 40 winters and had learned the town the way a hand learns a broom, by weight, by balance, by the small ache that means it's yours to carry. She knew how the wind tucked itself into the alley behind her shop and made a reed of the shutter's tongue. She knew the bell's voice when it spoke the hour. She knew it again when it spoke trouble. At dusk, she banked the fire. Her palms knew the distance between pan and coals without light, a soft rain of ash, a muted rustle, the last stubborn bright of a coal sinking into gray. The ladle hung in its place. The door's bar sat in the throat of its brackets with a sound of settled iron. In a niche above the bar, a little painted Mary, with a pale mouth, watched the room with a gaze that seemed to listen more than see. Marjorie touched the wood with 2 fingers, habit, not bargain, and told herself, as she did each night, that fear was a wild animal you neither fed nor dragged by a rope. Truth was, the animal was clever. It knew her by name. The first hour after curfew was the hour of inventory. Locks, bolts, shutters. The mental list recited backward and forward until the very act of listing became one more hinge to secure. Yet even in order, the noise came. There were steps in the lane, always steps, some quick and confident, some loose and wandering, some that tried to be quiet but could not help their drunken argument with the cobbles. Voices passed like weather. "Watch!" someone called once, not loudly, and somewhere a staff answered with 3 quick taps on stone, a ritual that meant, "I am here and listening." Then quiet again, the kind that wasn't empty, only layered. Marjorie feared thieves more than wolves. Wolves were honest. They sang their hunger. Thieves tested latches, tugged, waited. She had heard neighbors say the worst of them carried little iron hooks and could worry a bar free without so much as a cough to betray them. Last winter, old Folk the carter had woken to a hand in his chest, not a blade. A hand, a human palm pressing him flat as if to ease him back into sleep, while the other hand learned his house in the dark. Folk had whispered a prayer, and the hands had left. "That's mercy," the baker had said in the morning, and Folk had laughed like a man who had found mercy out behind his cows, hanging like a shirt on a hedge and left to the weather. So Marjorie kept the bar set firm and moved her stool near the hearth, where the embers kept time. On the table, a single candle worked bravely at its small circle of authority. The flame had a body, a waist that narrowed and widened when the door breathed. In its light, her hands looked older than they did in daylight. More stitches, more journeys. She smoothed wax on a cord for tomorrow's wicks, the way other women spun flax, feeling the material line its argument against her fingers. The fear of footsteps was a more private thing than the fear of thieves. Thieves were a problem, footsteps a riddle. Who knew what a step could carry? A friend who had stayed too long at ale and needed a shoulder. A lover who didn't want to be named. A stranger rehearsing the courage to do harm. Sometimes it was no one at all. The town itself settling. Wooden beams speaking to night in the slow grammar of expansion and rest. But then there were nights like the first spring after her husband died, when at the second hour a step paused directly outside her door. Another step. A breath, or what she called a breath with no proof. The candle's flame pulled toward the crack in the shutter as if curious. The bar was a comfort and a dare both at once. "Who's there?" she had said into that night. She was not a woman who chose silence. She had never been able to keep a question inside her. Her voice sounded like a child who knew the words to a psalm, but didn't know what they meant. There had been no answer, which was an answer of its own kind. After a while the steps receded, but the shape of them, the particular length of stride, the way the soul found the unevenness in the cobble, as if mapping it into a plan, that stayed. She wore that pattern like a worry bead. Even now, a year later, she could trace it in memory, and the tracing had weight. As for demons and witches, Marjorie believed and did not believe. The market had no end of stories. A hare that let itself be caught and turned into a woman in the corner of a shed. A black dog that walked beside a man for 3 miles and vanished like steam when the church came in sight. A shadow that tried every door on a lane and could not be seen directly, only in the corner of the eye. There were saints for each of these, if you knew their names. There were herbs. There were marks to chalk over the lintel. There was the cold logic of the night, which said that when a child sickened before dawn and recovered after sunrise, someone would be paid the price of that fear, whether or not they deserved it. She had her own small guard, the painted Mary, a sprig of yarrow pinned inside her sleeve, and a snippet of psalm learned as a girl from a priest who liked to have his homilies tidy. On most nights, she believed in what she could touch. Then sometimes, after the first hour, when the silence inside her became a mirror instead of a blanket, she felt how little there was between her and every rumor the town had ever told itself. What is a demon? She thought. Perhaps it is only the face a doubt wears when there is no light to contradict it. This night, the night our story chooses, was colder than the day had promised. The wind made a parchment of the lane and wrote on it with invisible ink. Somewhere a cow complained in the yard behind the tanner's house. Somewhere else, a door caught and clicked free again. Marjorie warmed her hands over the embers, palms down, not to touch, only to let the heat rise into her bones in a careful, domestic way. She drank water. The cup smelled faintly of beeswax. Everything in her life did. She thought of Edmund, her husband, who had grinned when he burned his fingertips, as though pain was a fee paid for belonging. She missed the sound he made when he turned in his sleep, a small, sighing argument with the straw. The second hour, steps, a stumble, laughter she didn't like, a hissed reprimand, then quiet, and the soft, practical sound of a latch tested 2 doors down. The town watch? She doubted it. Their knocking was official, a whole-body knock that made the wood answer like a drum. These were men who knew how to be smaller than they were. She thought of Folk's hands on his chest. She thought of the boy across the lane, Perkin, with his quick feet, and the pack of debts already yapping at his heels. She thought of nothing, and in the blank between thoughts, fear stepped neatly in. Panic arrived like a neighbor who never knocked, sudden, intimate, certain that the right to enter had long been established. It made her chest a cage for birds. It made the candles flame taller without giving more light. Marjorie closed her eyes and spoke the psalm, the one about the valley and the shadow, but the words wouldn't behave. They stuck in her mouth like dough and stumbled on each other. She opened her eyes again and spoke more slowly, not to an audience, not even to Mary on the shelf, but to the room itself. "Yeah, though I walk," she said, but she was not walking. She was sitting on a stool in a room that was a ship on a black sea, and the ship was the size of her courage. In panic, the mind pins meaning to smallest things. The tilt of the candle meant visitors. The ember's sudden sigh meant a draft, meant a crack, meant a gap an eye could press to. Her own breathing sounded like a person trying not to be heard. She looked at the bar and knew, with a clarity that emptied her hands, that wood and iron were not enough. The room seemed to lean. The door, the shutter, the ceiling, all slowly drawing toward the hinge where her night could open and pour away. Then a different noise, the official knock, 3 sure blows, and her name. Mistress Hale. The watchman's voice was thick with cold and duty both. "Are you within?" She stood, heart like a child running for a gate. The panic didn't leave, but it paused to see who else might want the stage. She went to the door and put her ear to the wood. "Is it you, Osbert?" she asked. The watchman laughed gently. "If it is not, it's a man who has stolen my voice as well as my staff." She lifted the bar halfway and felt fear tighten its hands again. "What do you want?" she said, managing a steadiness she didn't own. "There's been a quarrel near the bakehouse," Osbert said. "Nothing, I hope. Saw a light in your shutter as I passed. We're asking good folk to let their doors be doors tonight, that's all. 2 strangers in the town, and they've found courage after dark." A pause. "And Marjorie," he added, letting her name warm the night a little. "Keep your fire banked low. Wind's ill, and there was a spark at the Coopers earlier." The news was both comfort and alarm. Strangers, a story that knew how to dress itself in any decade. Courage after dark, a phrase that could mean thieves or boys, and boys could do damage as easy as men if they had nothing to lose. Marjorie lowered the bar again, carefully, ceremonially, so Osbert could hear her care, and thanked him. He knocked the doorframe once, a blessing in wood, and moved on, the staff's taps shrinking into the deep of the lane. After that, the room had a different shape. Panic had receded into the lattice of other nights. It had left behind a bright disorder, the way a child leaves a chair not quite where it was. Marjorie returned it to its place by the simple axe, smoothing the cloth over the table, straightening the little Mary, adding a pinch of ash to the hearth, where a coal had shown an interest in boldness. She stood still, and listened to the kind of silence you only get after a worry has spoken its piece. Her faith returned not as a victory, but as a rhythm. It was not that she believed more, only that believing was easier than holding the weight of imagining everything herself. She whispered a different prayer, one with no words, really, just a shape, like the cupped hands you make to carry water, and felt the room answer in the small ways that rooms do. A beam released its day-long argument with a nail. The window shutter settled. The draft agreed to the terms of the evening. But faith did not erase the other reckonings. On the shelf beside the Mary lay a purse with 3 coins and a lace of patience. Her husband had left her the shop and a handful of loyal customers. Fear could not pay rent, but it could spend pride. She had refused a remarriage for the good of the business from a man who wanted less a wife than a forewoman he could praise on market days. She had 2 candles promised to the priory, a dozen to the glover, and a string of tapers to the midwife, who paid on time and always with a smile that made the whole town feel a little less committed to its grimaces. When fear returned, and it always did, it wore other faces. There was the face of guilt, the one that asked her whether she'd banked the fire too low, and would wake to ash and the kind of cold that made the day an uphill road. There was the face of memory, Edmund's cough in winter, the way it had sounded like a broom dragged across floorboards, and the way the night had listened to it, with an interest she had never forgiven. There was the face that was only a mirror, in which she saw herself older than she wished to be, small in a world that valued size, alone in a world that mistrusted it. And then there was the face with horns, not literal. Horns lived in carvings and sermons. This face came when the hour grew thin and the stars pushed through the roof the way a thorn pushes through cloth. It was the feeling of being watched by something that did not want anything you could give it. The town had a name for it: the mare, the night hag, the thing that rode a sleeper's chest and made breath a hill. She had felt it twice in her life. Once as a girl, when a cat leapt onto her blanket and pressed the air out of her with its soft royal belly. Once the winter after Edmund died, when, between one breath and the next, she woke to a presence perched on the place where sorrow and sleep meet, and knew with a bone-deep certainty that if she moved, even the width of a thread, she would learn something she did not want to know. It had passed when the bell called prime. She had risen and washed her face and told no one. You did not give rumors more bodies to occupy. Tonight, as if to prove it had a sense of humor, the cat from the tanner's yard found the half-loose tile on her roof and tested it with the deliberate care only cats own. Tile tapped beam. Beam told tile the terms. Somewhere beyond, a fox spoke as if confiding in the moon. The steps that had haunted her had not returned. In their place, time itself made the noises. The long-drawn exhale of the wind, the quick thought of a mouse in the wall, the tiny applause of the candle when wax met wick just so. The third hour, between the world and its other world, a seam you could finger but not pull. Marjorie stood and stretched her back, vertebrae counting themselves softly. She went to the shutter and lifted the latch just long enough to make a knife of sight between 2 slats. The lane was a ribbon of dark, with a few stitches of torchlight disappearing into its weave. She smelled the town as if it were a living thing asleep, sour and warm and full of dreams. On the far side of the lane, the bakehouse's door wore a blackness that suggested a hand had been there and left, and she wondered whether Osbert's warning had been timely or late. A breath at her shoulder. She turned, hand to throat, and laughed, small and embarrassed, because it was only the draft changing its mind at the corner of the room. But the laugh came with tears hitching behind it, and she let them, 2 quick visitors, their feet clean because they were not asked to stay. She wiped her cheeks with the inside of her sleeve where the yarrow sprig lay, and the herb's dry, bitter smell steadied her. Even saints, she thought, must get tired of being asked the same questions. Even fear must grow bored with itself and wander off to find someone new. By the 4th hour, night had settled into its slow apprenticeship to morning. Marjorie's candle had shortened to a humility she admired. She pinched it out and let the embers' small red city be enough. She lay on her straw mattress and pulled the wool up to her chin and did the arithmetic of safety. Bar, bolt, prayer, neighbor's ears, watchman's staff, her own stubborn heart. Against these, she imagined the ledger of danger, strangers in town, a latch's weakness, a roof tile that told secrets, all the ways a story could unspool if given a sharp tug. Between faith and panic, there was room for a person. She lay in that room and listened and thought of the morning, of dough and trade and the miller's laugh, which was big enough to be furniture. She thought of the midwife and the way she said a blessing like she was folding bread, strong and gentle and certain something good would rise. She thought of the boy Perkin, who would pass her door with a hunger that was no one's fault and everyone's problem, and she wondered whether she might find him a task, not as charity, which can humiliate, but as exchange, which respects. She counted these futures the way other people count sheep, and the counting was kinder. Yet night is possessive. It had one more test to set, a clatter out back where the yard met the alley. Too loud for a cat, too deliberate for chance. Something metal, her bucket, touched and put down again. A breath later, the soft and unmistakable scrape of a boot sole on dry grit. She sat up fast enough to startle her own heart. The room, which had been a cradle, became, in an instant, a problem to solve. She did not call out. She did not reach for the poker. She walked to the back door, which was smaller and less proud than the front, and put her hand on the wood. She felt, through thickness of oak and centuries of habit, the ghost of warmth that meant a person stood on the other side. Or not a person, her fear suggested, reaching for its horns and cloak. She closed her eyes again and listened past fear's harvest to the field underneath. "Perkin," she said, not loudly, "if that's you, you're about to learn the knack of being turned into Osbert and set to sweep the bakehouse yard until Lammas." Silence. Then a breath that was not wind. Then relief and sorrow at once. The small, defeated voice of a boy who had not yet learned how to make night his accomplice. "Mistress," he said, "I only wanted to test every door in the lane until one wanted you back," she finished for him. She set her back to the door so he would not hear her slide down it and sit on the floor, knees up, as if there were a field behind her instead of a yard. "Go home, Perkin," she said, "and if you have no home to go to, then go to the priory door and knock until Brother Jacob forgets his grudge and gives you bread. If you touch my bucket again, you'll wear it like a crown down the lane to the gate, and the watch will clap for you." She could hear him trying not to imagine that. Boys build pictures quickly. "Yes, mistress," he said, and the mistress slid through the crack in the door like a scarf. Not bronze coins, but not nothing. His steps retreated in an unconvincing attempt at stealth, and then the yard was its inventory again. 2 planks, a stump, a bucket, a wind that meant no harm. Marjorie breathed. The kind of breath that ends the argument and starts the washing up. She sat there a moment longer, then stood, rubbed the back of her neck, and smiled at Mary as though both of them had just lifted something heavier than either would care to show off. She thought of Osbert, who would pass again before dawn. She thought of the boy, who would either obey or not. She thought of Edmund in a season when he hadn't coughed yet, when his shoulders were wide with work and hope, and of how he'd once said, "Night is only a story told by the sun when it's tired." Trust in God, panic before shadows. These were the 2 ropes she had learned to hold, one in each hand, not to braid them, not to choose one over the other, but to be pulled by each in turn without stumbling. The night would keep its surprises. She would keep her shop, her prayers, her readiness to speak through a door when it mattered. If the mare came, she would outlast it. If a thief tried a latch, she would shame a boy before she harmed him, and call a man by his name if he had one, and if she knew it. Outside, the town turned another page in its slow book. A cock, confused, suggested dawn and was ignored. The river laid its steady talk along the quay. Somewhere, a woman in labor bit down on leather, and a midwife told another kind of prayer toward a different kind of door. Marjorie lay back down and thought of flame. How it makes a promise and keeps it as long as it can. How it asks to be fed and does not pretend otherwise. How it frees you to see enough to live and refuses to show you more than you can bear. Morning would come, as it always did, and bring with it the long comfort of tasks. For now, the fear had been counted and given names. The strangers would either sleep or run. The boy would either learn or not. The watchman would either be where he said he'd be, or the town would adjust in the old, practiced ways it had when men failed. Marjorie turned on her side. The straw said its polite complaint, and in the space between the last word of a prayer and the first word of the day, she let the night be what it was. Not an enemy exactly, not a friend, an old, stern teacher with lessons delivered in footsteps, in drafts, in the discipline of the bar laid true. By day, a town is a set of agreements. By night, it is a set of suspicions. The same streets that hold markets and gossip at noon become, after curfew, a legal question. Who belongs here now? In Marjorie's town, the answer was simple and complicated all at once. No one and only a few. The bell gave its instruction. The gates shut with a confidence that felt like mercy to those within and cruelty to those without. And darkness reclaimed its jurisdiction. There was no street light as we know it. Light did not belong to the town. It belonged to pockets, to candles hoarded for feast days, to torches in the hands of men who had business and the willingness to be seen doing it. Fire was a risk with a long memory. Thatched roofs listened with the attention of tinder. Too much light at the wrong hour could make a morning of ash. A city might tend a brazier in the market on a holy night, or a great house might keep lanterns set like small arguments along a wall. But lanes remained lanes, narrow, intimate, black as uninked parchment. Poor households drew rushlights, reeds dipped in tallow, that hissed and guttered and gave a light like a half-kept promise. The wealthy spent beeswax like a psalm, but even they rationed flame. The dark was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a neighbor, powerful and quick to take offense. When the bell tolled curfew, it did more than measure time. It folded the map. The great gates, north and south, boomed shut. The wicket doors were latched, and men in padded jacks took their rounds along the wall walk. A late traveler could plead, but pleading after sunset had an ugly reputation. The porter, with his keys like a rosary of iron, rarely became a savior. Outside, strangers made their own camp. A cart tipped to windward, a horse tied low, a fire pinched small, ears working like anxious wings. Inside, the town tightened its circle. The rule was not simply be indoors. The rule was be known. Night did not forgive anonymity. This is where the watch comes in. Not a modern police, but a habit of vigilance given cudgels and authority. Some men took the duty as a civic burden. More took it as wages. Thin, late, never certain. A watchman's staff was as much a tool of rhythm as of law. Tap, tap, tap along the stones. A public heartbeat meant to say, "We are awake for you." Yet power at night grows barbs. The same cudgel that steadied a drunk back to his door could settle a grudge between neighbors, could collect a small tax of fear at a corner where the watchman's cousin kept a stall. The night rewarded practical justice. Shout first, ask later. Bind now, sort in the morning. Stocks were a day thing, but the hue and cry belonged to both worlds. If a voice tore the dark with thief, every hand was conscripted until the name of the offender and the owner of the breath matched, or one of them broke. The watch carried a list of offenses that changed with the wind and the alderman. No carrying of uncovered fire, no brawling, no singing in alleys after the second hour. A rule aimed at taverns more than at music. No masks, no hoods drawn too deep, no knives unless wrapped, no women alone unless respectable and recognized, which meant what the watchman said it meant. In the gray territory between protection and intimidation, a man like Osbert tried to be decent. Others were not Osbert. Marjorie knew both kinds. Everyone did. Danger begins with what you can see, but fear begins with what you can't. In a town without light, rumor becomes a lantern. It swings. It throws faces up and then throws them away. The week a comet scraped a white nail across the sky, men spoke softly to one another, even at noon. The winter the wolves were hungry enough to test hedges within hearing of the church. Children learned new rules about doors. The summer a plague cart went twice through the market in one day. Everyone avoided the lanes that led past the priory infirmary. Even a healthy cough acquired a theology. Fear had preferred habitats, crossroads, where ghosts were said to misunderstand directions on purpose, gallows hills, where a wrong turn could set your name in someone else's mouth, churchyards, which were close friends with mercy and with bones. A town is a web of these places, and at night the web gleams with superstition. There were night rules every household kept, as reliably as sweeping. Some were safety. Bank the fire low and draw ash over the red. Lay the poker so its handle points to the hearth, not into the room. Hang the bucket where a hand can find it without searching. Lift the latch twice, once to seat it, and once to teach your fingers the habit. Some were social. Never open the door to a whisper. Never answer a call that knows your name too well. If the watch knocks, make him say his own name. If a neighbor begs admittance for fear of a beating, you weigh charity against your own children's sleep, and the bar on your door gives the verdict. And some were frankly magical, a public secret. Chalk marks beside a lintel, a wheel, a cross, a tangle of lines with old names, a hagstone hung by a cord, iron buried at the threshold. a sprig of St. John's wort above the cradle, yarrow stitched into a cap, a scrap of scripture tucked under a pillow. Not everyone believed, but everyone lived as if belief kept the roof on. Prayer took its shape from the hours. The church taught compline, that last public prayer before sleep, and anyone's window could become a little chapel when voices from the priory drifted over gardens and carts. Words calcify into comfort when repeated at the same hour. A candle guttering in a window could mean many things. Lack of coin, lack of courage, lack of care. But it almost always meant someone finishing a rosary, counting the night into obedience. Marjorie's town kept a saint for travelers, another for fires, another for sudden fear. Names mattered. Sometimes a man muttered them like passwords while crossing a lane where knives liked to learn their craft. Because the gates were closed, the economy of night was domestic and discreet. The baker, who could not afford fear of flame, woke in the belly of the dark. His glow stained the street like dawn misplaced. The midwife walked wherever she must, and the watch gave way. Birth writes its own permits. A tanner might stir his pits by starlight to spare the neighbors' noses by day. And boys who had worked for a penny at noon looked for a second penny after curfew, which is how door latches were tested and how a woman like Marjorie learned the sound of a desperate foot as opposed to a cruel one. At the edges of law, alehouses worked a private trade, shutters wide enough for a cup to pass and narrow enough for denial. If a fight broke there, it was the town's problem at sunrise, which is why watchmen sometimes stood 2 corners away and studied the philosophy of letting quarrels finish themselves. Night amplified status. A master had the right to knock and be known. An apprentice had the obligation to return with his ears unbloodied. A woman walking alone after the first hour, even a widow with honest business, entered a courtroom of eyes where verdicts were fast and often wrong. To be a stranger at night was a kind of crime. Travelers respected that truth with money, renting a straw corner near the gate, a spot in a stable, a place inside a cart, and laying their purse under their shoulder. The town respected it by assigning blame to strangers first. That logic was ungenerous and efficient, the 2 most popular virtues after sunset. All of this, the lack of light, the closing of gates, the cudgel law, the rumor-lit sky, trained a collective body. The town learned to hold its breath together. People did not simply fear the night. They performed their fear in ways that kept the group intact. Mothers told the same cautionary tale in different kitchens so that children learned not to open doors for music. Men who felt less brave than they hoped tapped their knives against their belts so a sound could do the work of confidence. A neighbor, hearing footsteps after the second hour, lifted his cough to a public volume, the polite signal that a witness existed. The watch answered with its staff. A dog answered with a bark. The dark answered with its favorite reply, nothing at all. And the human heart, faced with silence, did the rest. Ask how night grows its cruelty, and you'll hear 2 competing testimonies. One says men are cruel in the dark because dark is permission. The other says dark is cruel because men leave holes in the net of the law. Both are right. Night collects the offcuts. The quarrels kept decent at noon become honest at midnight. The debt resisted in market day presents its account at a tavern door. The hand that never meant to steal learns, under the patient tutelage of hunger, to be very good at it. Add to this the mystic arithmetic of the age, eclipses and comets as commentaries, a sow that won't settle as a sign, dreams that the priest can be made to explain for a fee. The wild hunt, riding the cloud line for those who have enemies to accuse. Darkness is thus not only a physical condition, it is a theater where law and superstition improvise together. Inside that theater, ritual is the stagecraft. Marjorie's town kept simple liturgies of survival. Keys hung in the same place every night, so a hand could find them without sight. Shoes were placed toes out by the bed to face danger first, so a child's toes did not. Pails were left full near the hearth, and roof ladders leaned where a neighbor could grab them. A fire might belong to one house at midnight and to 3 streets by matins. Names of the watch were learned, then rehearsed. Osbert, Hugh, Lode, and Tom, a catechism not found in books. Even the floorboards had rules. This one complains, skip it. That one holds, trust it. When the mind is a lantern you carry inside your skull, such rules are the oil. And then, because human beings cannot live on fear alone, there were shared comforts. A lane might adopt its own small countersign. 3 raps on a door, answered by 2. A promise that your knock would not cause a scream. A windowsill might hold a blessed crumb of salt to be touched by each passer, like dipping fingers at a font, but for a street. On certain nights, the watch sang badly to keep their courage. On feast evenings, psalms bled into drinking songs through the shutters, and no one minded the crossing. In those hours, the dark softened. A dog rolled to show its belly. The river sounded less like a sermon and more like a lull. Still, the town's consensus was simple and old. Night does not belong to people, not entirely. It belongs to saints and their patience, to thieves and their grammar, to animals with eyes that can make coin of a star, to angels, if you had a mind to trust them, to demons, if you had a mind to explain what happened in rooms where nobody claimed to be. When a midwife spoke of the fretful hour, that gray seam when a baby fights the world, it was the same hour when men at cards realized they had lost more than coin, and when a housewife, listening to a shutter pecked by wind, decided that tomorrow she would pay a priest to walk her rooms with a bell. Curfews were the town's way of arguing with the supernatural using timber and law. But even the aldermen understood that the bar across a gate was a symbol as much as a device. It kept armies out, and tired merchants, and luck, and plague, and none of those. It kept in the men who made trouble and the peace they felt justified in breaking. It kept in the needs a market could not advertise by day. It gave the watch a stage to stride, and it gave rumor a bowl to echo in. It gave a widow the conviction that the world could be made small enough to be stewarded. When morning comes, towns congratulate themselves for having survived, as though day were an achievement rather than a turn of the earth. But the night has done work. It has sorted the brave from the reckless. It has taught children where boards creak and where dogs sleep. It has tested the baker's timing and the watchman's fairness. It has seasoned stories small and large so they will be told with relish by noon. And it has reminded everyone, again, of their place in the order. God above, law between, luck beneath, and night around. Marjorie knew these truths the way a candle knows its melt. She could recite the bylaw and the blessing. She could smell rain in the lids of her jars, and danger and laughter that didn't care who heard it. She had learned to live in a town that after sunset became a congregation of listeners. Each house a cupped hand, each alley an ear, each footstep a sentence that might end safely if the right witness stepped to the window. She had also learned that some sentences do not end. They thin and continue from door to door, from story to story, until they sound less like threat and more like weather. So when people said, as they often did, that night belonged to the other world, they did not mean it as surrender. They meant it as a settlement. We will keep our doors and our prayers. We will keep our watch and our rules. We will keep our herbs and our saints. And you, whatever you are, may have the fields, the hedges, the crossroads, the empty yard behind the tanner's house where the wind behaves oddly. We will meet you at the threshold, which is no man's land and everyone's. We will not invite. We will not ignore. We will live as if our small lights matter, and that will be our share of the bargain. And if sometimes the bargain fails, as bargains do, the town will adjust in the ways all towns have always adjusted. There will be a sermon about watchfulness. There will be a new rule about latches. There will be a boy sent to the priory for bread and then to the baker for work. There will be a woman like Marjorie who answers a knock not with opening but with language, and the night will shiver and consider whether it has chosen the right house. There will be stories of torches on the wall, of wolves on the road, of saints under the tongue. By noon, they will look like history. By dusk, they will have ripened back into warnings. Thus, the social body learned and remembers. The dark is a power, but not the only one. A bar across the door is wood. A community's habits are oak. A watchman's staff is ash. A neighbor's cough is law. A candle's flame is small. A shared prayer is many-mouthed. Together, these are how human beings answer the night, warily, stubbornly, with a mixture of fear and craft. And because they answer together, the night, however fierce, cannot quite claim them. It may rule the lanes, it may rule the hedge, but in the space from hearth to bar, from whispered name to answered knock, people keep their portion of sovereignty, and with it, each other. History is not only a sequence of daylight deeds, it is also an archive of nights, of what people feared, what they forbade, and what they built so that fear would not run the town by itself. If Marjorie's candle makes a small bowl of safety on her table, the world beyond her shutter is where law, legend, and custom negotiated for centuries with the stubborn facts of darkness. First, the institutions. Long before uniforms and whistles, communities stitched together a system from what they had: bodies, bells, and rules. In many towns, the curfew bell did two kinds of labor. It measured time, and it shrunk the map. After the bell, streets ceased to be public roads and became conditional spaces, passable only to those the town already recognized. The great gates boomed shut. Wicket doors were latched. A late traveler was not an inconvenience. He was a problem with a face. To enforce that shrinking, householders took turns on the watch and ward, the watch by night, the ward by day. It was a civic habit before it was a profession. Men who had haggled over fish at noon took a cudgel at dark and learned a new grammar: 3 taps to announce presence, a shouted stand. For law, a hand on a shoulder to show a line had been crossed. If someone cried thief, the old custom of hue and cry dissolved the boundary between private citizen and public duty. Every ear became an oath, every foot a chase, until the matter was settled, or sunrise put a better face on it. Towns codified this improvisation. By the late medieval period, charters and statutes required night watches, defined curfews, and punished noctivagants, those who wandered after hours without cause or light. Some places demanded that a man out after dark carry a lamp or a lantern, not mainly to see by, but to be seen by, a visible promise to the neighborhood. Others forbade any uncovered flame outdoors, simply because so much of a medieval town was eager to burn. These rules made a virtue of necessity. Without street lamps, the safest policy was to keep night still. The watch was never only benevolent. Darkness makes power feel larger in the hand. A cudgel can herd a drunk back to his door. It can also collect a debt of deference. In the same hour, the watch might save the baker's street from a wandering spark and roust a harmless apprentice for walking with a hood too low over his brow. Still, the seed of policing lies here, in this rotating duty, these curfews, these shared expectations that after the bell, the town contracts and defends its smaller self. What later centuries centralized and professionalized was born as a neighborhood bargain, held together by oaths, fines, and habit, with fear supplying the mortar. Then the stories. Darkness births explanations where sight cannot serve. Many of Europe's sturdier myths wear the night like a uniform. Werewolves were not just animals that forgot their manners. They were men imagined to have stepped across the line between citizen and predator and learned to pass through hedge and lane with a hunter's ear. Trials for such creatures clustered not because fur grew more readily in one century than another, but because night makes identity ambiguous. If a sheep dies at a field's edge and no footsteps are certain, the mind supplies pause. Vampires, a word that ripened later, though the dread is older, do a different kind of night work. They turn after-hours breath and sleep's paralysis into a narrative with teeth, a body that looks too whole after burial, a cough in a shut room, a weight on the chest at dawn. All these become evidence, not of illness or grief's cruel physiology, but of a neighbor who refused to stay properly dead and preferred the social life of the dark. The nightmare, the hag that sits on the sleeper and taxes the lungs, is likewise a name for an event the nervous system can produce without help, the mind awake inside a body that has not remembered how to move. Yet once named, such experiences attract not only explanation, but rituals. Iron by the bed, a prayer pinned into a cap, blessed chalk over a lintel. The ritual soothes, and the story gains legs. Witches thrive in the hours when other authorities sleep. The Sabbath, noisy, hidden, lit by a moon the church could not domesticate, was imagined as a counter-assembly, making pacts where priests could not listen, placing fires where watchmen were thin. Whether or not anyone flew by night, night made it easier to believe that someone could. When human beings render the world into moral geography, darkness becomes the borderland, the place where piety feels less sure of itself, and blame can be posted like a watchbill. So the lore gathers at hedges, crossroads, churchyards, and gallows hills, and not because demons prefer scenic venues, but because our attention does. Night also writes law. Medieval ordinances treated after-hours wrongdoing as more than mere mischief. To break into a house by daylight might provoke a fine or a flogging. To break in by night put the crime into a different constellation, one that included terror and the possibility of blood. The old definition of burglary itself privileges darkness, breaking and entering another's dwelling at night with felonious intent. The law thus admits what the heart already knows, that a heel on a threshold at 2 a.m. is not the same fact as a heel at 2 p.m. Darkness magnifies motive, and law, trying to keep pace with intimacy's dread, magnifies penalty. From the vantage of institutions, you can draw a straight line, crooked in detail, but plain in direction, from Marjorie's watch and ward to later systems that tied night to the state's authority. Urban governments gathered the night watch under central command. They inventoried lanterns, mapped patrols, fixed wages, and standardized knock-and-call protocols. Over time, whistles replaced bells in narrow lanes. Night became a schedule, not just a condition. In some places, the state even made a virtue of illumination. Lantern schemes, oil lamps, then gas and electric light converted hours rather than habits, turning evening into a second day for commerce and a new arena for regulation. Fear did not vanish. It changed address. Crime, of course, kept its clock. Darkness remains the conspirator's hour. Medieval chronicles are frank about it. Betrayals arranged under shutters, payments left beneath stones, arson practiced as a politics by other means. A timber town burns readily, and a crowd lit by panic is its own weather. Fires that begin at night teach a whole city what roofs are made of, and what neighbors are made of, too. Quiet murders, family matters, inheritance contests, a feud that refused to be content with alleys, disliked witnesses, and so preferred the curtain the night provides. And plots, from tavern whispers to earnest schemes against magistrates, grow in the dark, where a man can rehearse a disloyalty without seeing his own face do it. Yet night does not only serve the wicked, it also protects the vulnerable. The midwife strides the lanes by moon, and the watch yields. Lovers make treaties the day would mock. A hungry boy takes a crust through a shutter and starts tomorrow with one less crime to his name. Smugglers invent economies that keep a poor street breathing. Night is a toolbox, and not every hand that reaches in means harm. That untidiness of good deeds and bad using the same shadow is part of why darkness is historically interesting. It refuses our simple catechisms. How, then, did these medieval habits survive into modern feeling? Why does the fear that ruled Marjorie's Lane still live under American porch lights and on city stoops, in cinema, and in the language our bodies speak when a hallway darkens? Part of the answer is physiological. Human eyes are not built for night labor. The brain is cautious when input thins. The amygdala, diligent at its post, votes early and often for suspicion. But the larger part is cultural memory. Laws taught us that night intensifies guilt. Religion taught us that night is a test. Custom taught us to perform vigilance after the bell. Those lessons calcified into landscapes, street grids with corners you hurry past, porch lights that are not only for seeing the keyhole, neighborhood watches that borrow both the name and the performative tapping of their medieval ancestors. Popular culture is a ledger where these continuities are tallied. The American horror film inherits Europe's catalog of night things and adds modern anxieties to the costume. Werewolves wear adolescence. Vampires wear hunger and charisma. Witches wear the politics of women's power. The setting is still the hour when the town turns its lights in. Even in cities that never fully darken, shots linger on alley mouths like medieval lanes. A slasher's footstep is the old riddle in the cobbles. A ghost's cold breath on a scripted window is the draft Marjorie reads for news. The soundtrack offers a surrogate for the watchman's tap, tap, tap. Percussion announcing that law is awake, then stopping to let dread do its work. Consider also how lighting itself carries meanings that reach back to the Priory's compline. A well-lit storefront feels like a chapel of safety. A flickering bulb in a basement sets our teeth on edge because it resembles a candle in trouble. Curfews still surface in civic life, declared during unrest or storm, reviving the medieval logic that the map is safer when it is smaller. And night watch survives as a phrase for professions noble and routine: nurses, firefighters, security guards. A hospital at 3 a.m. is a priory with antibiotics and badges. Its beeps and rounds are secular hours that keep terror out by counting time into usefulness. We also inherit the moral geography of medieval nights. Crossroads remain uneasy. Underpasses, the backs of warehouses, threshold spaces where no one's manners seem to apply. Churchyards are park lawns by day, and cautionary tales for children at dusk. Gallows hills have modern cousins in dead zones of infrastructure, the lots where no business has decided to live, and so rumor rents cheaply. We dress the new night in the old theory because the old theory, for all its quaintness, still helps us orient ourselves when the senses are ungenerous. The law's memory is clearest. Modern criminal codes no longer need the night to define burglary, but sentencing and public sentiment still treat after-dark acts as aggravated. News reports include the hour as a moral. The break-in occurred at 2 in the morning, a cue for the reader's body to react in sympathy with the ancient household, hand on bar, ear at shutter. Jurors who sleep with deadbolts and doorbell cameras silently concur with a widow who pressed 2 fingers to a painted saint. Even our technology keeps ritual. We arm a system. We watch a feed. We text a neighbor. New tools for old feelings. In this sense, fear becomes heritage, not a pathology to be cured, but a practice to be managed. Rules about keys, codes, and lights. A shared vocabulary of check in when you get home. A civic expectation that some part of the city stays awake for the parts that can't. The medieval night made this bargain explicit. The modern night camouflages it with lumens and convenience, but the terms have changed less than we pretend. If you want the long view, look again at Marjorie and the watchman, Osbert. Between them stands a door, wood on iron, plus trust, plus custom, plus the promise that if the night asks too much, day will answer with adjustments. A new ordinance, a repaired latch, a sermon, a story. That cycle is how societies metabolize fear without letting it poison the bloodstream. The watch becomes a service. The service becomes a department. The department acquires oversight. The oversight breeds its own kind of rumor. The rumor is resurrected by films and legends. The films teach children to listen for footsteps, which, if they are lucky, only means they will listen hard enough to hear their own home settle and will call that sound by its right, ordinary name. And the myths, they too adapt. The vampire moves to the city and trades coffins for clubs. The werewolf keeps the moon but learns subways. The witch is recast from criminal to protagonist, carrying forward the old recognition that some powers travel after dark. None of this is a failure of reason. It is reason being honest about the dark's persistence. For as long as nights fall, we will keep story and statute close at hand. One tells us what might be out there. The other tells us what we will do if it is. When the night finally thins, as it always does, even on days when the world feels stalled, what remains are structures and stories. Gates become metaphors. Watches become shifts. Curfew becomes bedtime. A saint's name becomes a password or a lock code. The medieval answer to darkness was collective and layered. A bar across the door. A rule for fire. A man with a staff. A prayer with good posture. A tale sharp enough to warn, but not so sharp it cuts hope. Our answer, if we look closely, is the same. We carry forward the choreography. Limit, patrol, illuminate, narrate. So when Americans sit down to a horror film, or pull a porch chain to bleed a little light into the yard, or read a neighborhood app with its small nocturnal dramas, they are not modern in any decisive sense. They are old as the lanes where Marjorie counted her breaths. What we call urban fear is simply the echo of a long apprenticeship to darkness, an inheritance of curfews and candles, of watchmen and whispers, of crimes that preferred the second world layered over the first. We keep the fear because it keeps us. We tame it because it would tame us. And in that long negotiated truce, we have built both our cities and our stories. It began with the bell forgetting its manners, not the measured monastic count that let a town name the hour, but a frantic, gasping clamor, iron striking iron in a rhythm meant to pull sleep out of houses by the roots. Marjorie woke from the kind of half-rest that is mostly listening. Smoke was in the room before she could see it, a thin, bitter handwriting. Outside, a voice tore the lane open. Fire! To the river. Fire at the Coopers. The shutter showed its red news even through the slats. She set her palm to the bar, felt it warm as breath, and lifted it. The lane beyond was a broken page written in orange and black. Sparks skittered like insects along the eaves. Somewhere wood shrieked, the long animal cry a beam gives when it forgets how to be a beam. Osbert was at her door with the flat of his hand, his staff tucked under his arm, his face striped with light. Buckets! Ladders. Mistress Hale, keep inside or come quick, but choose, choose. The words stood between two worlds. Behind her, the shop, the little painted Mary, the banked ember like a city seen from far away. Before her, a street remade into a river that ran uphill toward a crown of flame. She tied a scarf over her mouth, took the roof ladder from its hook, caught up 2 buckets, and told the Mary in her mind, not her mouth. If I leave, watch the embers. If I stay, watch the boy. The wind had turned mischievous. The Cooper's yard, pitched tubs, stacks of staves, hoop iron like sleeping serpents, was a catalog of things that agreed too readily with fire. The flames wrote themselves up the side of the bakehouse, as if it were a word they had been waiting all winter to spell. Men ran, as if learning how to again. The particular, galloping awkwardness of a body making top speed in bad shoes. Women threw shawls over hair and over babies and over the past, then followed. The watch hammered door frames for buckets and got curses and thanks in equal measure. Above it all, the sky had its own mischief. The moon, veiled by smoke, had turned a patient, bloody coin. Someone shouted, "Sign!" and the word spread like fire spreads, without needing proof. Children pointed with hands they were supposed to keep on their mother's skirts. A woman looked up and wept the way you weep at sermons, because sometimes terror and truth live in the same throat. For a moment the town looked 2 ways at once, at the red mouth eating a roof, and at the red face watching. "Chain!" Osbert bellowed, and somewhere a line obeyed. Buckets moved hand to hand with the strange intimacy of shared panic. Calloused palms slapping wet wood, small acknowledgments in the eyes. Marjorie slid her ladder to a neighbor's low eave where Sparks had taken interest and climbed, her joints counting their objections and going anyway. "Down, mistress," someone called. "You'll break your neck." She did not look down. She flung the ladder's hook over the ridge and crawled to a blistering patch of thatch that had begun to glow like bread before it browns. She tore away armfuls and flung them to the yard where men stamped, and a piece seized her sleeve with hot teeth. She beat it out with her other hand and learned in that instant how quickly a wool smell can become frightening. Below, the bakehouse door banged and banged. A voice inside, thin, furious, kept time with the bell. "Bolt stuck!" cried a girl from the step, eyes wide as coins. "My aunt! She's inside!" The crowd, being a crowd, divided into a rescue and a doctrine. "God save us," said one. "The baker's wife is cursed, I told you. I told you. A sign at her birth?" "Hold your tongue," said another, happily not meaning it. A third voice, young and raw, tried the bolt with a bar of hoop iron. Perkin. He glanced up at Marjorie, and in that glance were all last night's smaller crimes and this night's larger courage. She scrambled down, knees reminding her of every winter she had lived in this town, and pushed past elbows to the door. "Back," she said, steady and loud, the tone women use on goats and men both. Perkin wedged the iron again. She set her shoulder beside his. "On 3, she said, "and the 3 is mine." The bar complained, then sobbed, then yielded with a sound that felt unholy in the bones. Smoke billowed the way lies do when exposed, and out came the baker's wife, soot-faced, hair loose, carrying a tray as if habits outrank situations. Someone laughed, hysterical, grateful, and the laugh turned the crowd warm for a heartbeat. Then the roof of the cooper's shed like a judgment collapsed inward, and the warmth became heat, and heat became hurry. "Line to the river, 2 by 2. Osbert's voice did what it could. The watch were 4 men tonight. Osbert, Hugh, Lode, and Tom. And 4 men are larger than 3, but smaller than fire. They planted themselves where law would be useful later, and where buckets were useful now. Marjorie pressed her own into the hands of a boy whose mouth was open more than necessary, and set him between a sober woman and an old man who met crisis with the same grim good humor he brought to everything. The moon, more the color of a bruise now, snagged another rumor. The gates are open. A man shouted it, and 10 people believed him, and 20 people decided to run just in case, because flight is a doctrine with no membership fee. The chain faltered. Water slopped. A woman screamed a name that no one owned. In the confusion, a man with a hood, too deep, eased toward a shutter, with his hand already in the shape a stealing hand has. Crowd is weather. It rains on who happens to be in the field. Perkin, seeing him, flung himself like a dog at a goose and got an elbow for his pains. He curled protectively, not after his ribs, but around the little purse he had nowhere better to hide. The watch were too many tasks away to notice. Marjorie noticed. "Osbert," she called, but Osbert was an acre of competing advice. She took the shortcut her life had taught her. She called the thief's name. Not his real one. The name a town gives a kind. "Hugh Jarley," she said, as if scolding a nephew with a known appetite for plum tarts. "If you take so much as a hinge from that shutter tonight, I'll tell your sister what sort of man you are." The hood turned in reflex. Name is spell enough. And Perkin loped forward from the ground with the hoop iron, not to strike, but to show. The thief discovered he had pressing business elsewhere, and abandoned the problem of whether to be brave. A sigh went through the lane, the sound a town makes when one terror distracts it from a second for just long enough to cheat neither. The chain regained shape. Hands remembered the work and stopped narrating it. Water met fire with its old, exhausted argument. Sparks fled up like a reverse snowfall. On the far side, a thatch caught, and men shouted, and the line bent like a river does when it loves the land too much to cut a straight course. And then, because panic breeds like rabbits, Someone cried, "Attack!" A shadow at the gate, a cart shifting in heat, nothing more, made itself into news. People who had never seen an army believed in one, because believing is quicker than verifying when your skin is prickling. The bell, still wounded, lent its voice. For a count of 10, the town broke. Doors banged, shoulders surged. A woman tripped and vanished into other people's problems. "Hold!" Osbert roared, and the word was not a command so much as a rope he threw. He found the ends of 3 men and tied them together with his anger. "There is no attack. If there is, we will see it when the flames are down. If the gate opens, you will hear the porter swear, and I will swear back, and the 2 oaths will be your signal." He planted his staff like a banner. The crowd hated him for a breath, and then consented to be grateful. This is leadership at midnight. You buy 10 seconds and spend them in buckets. Marjorie climbed again, not to fight the main blaze. That was the Cooper's argument now, tragic and thorough, but to keep the town from becoming all Cooper. A spark had lodged under her own eave. She hooked the ladder, belly to the slope, knees bruising, and pulled at the thatch until the glow lost interest. The wind changed its mind, and her scarf filled with cinders, and she coughed until her ribs tallied their objections. Below, Perkin ran like a messenger who trusts no one else with his news, ferrying empty bucket to full to empty again, a hinge in the chain that squeaked and held. "Woman in labor!" someone shouted, and a path opened the way paths do when fear meets a larger fear. The midwife, face set like a captain, sailed down the lane with her kit, and even the men who believed women had no rightful errands at this hour stepped aside. The night, jealous, tried to reclaim her with smoke, failed. For an instant, the town remembered that it was built for more than avoiding harm. It could not last at fever pitch. Fire eats fast and then sulks. Timber that had shouted went to hissing. Buckets that had thumped went to splashing like a bath. The moon, tired of being a sermon, faded toward ordinary. The bell fell quiet the way a sob does, when another breath finally finds a way in. The Cooper's shed was a black tooth against the sky. The bakehouse sweated and held. The thatches were dampened like hair after a storm. People looked at their hands and found them useful and shaking. Only then did the crowd perform its last trick. Having been brave and terrified, it desired to be righteous. A voice, no one's friend, everyone's echo, named a cause. Witch's sign? The baker's wife. Her cry started it. Another voice named another. The boy, Perkin, was seen behind the yard. The air grew lean again. A ring formed around a woman who was too exhausted to argue, and a boy who had finally remembered he was small. Law and superstition, having cooperated all evening, each claimed the right to write the epilogue. Marjorie stepped into the ring as you step onto black ice. Bold, so you won't be careful. "If you must accuse," she said, "accuse me. I pulled burning thatch. My sleeve smoked. I said the name of God out loud, and if that offends you, then carry me to the gallows yourself, and we'll see whether rope burns as fine as your words." The boy worked. She put her hand on Perkin's shoulder, and the hand shook, and she did not hide it. "The sign in the sky?" She pointed with an ash-streaked finger at the moon, which had the decency to look less apocalyptic now. "That's the face the world wears when we light half the street and ask the heavens to be polite about it." Osbert came then, face ash-gray, eyes ordinary and tired. He lifted his staff, not to strike, but to draw a line on the ground. He had very little authority, which is what most authority is made of. If there are accusations, he said, bring them when the light is proper and the clerk's pen is sharp. Tonight belongs to buckets and roofs, he could have added, and to children born when they please. Because somewhere behind them a woman groaned and a baby made its first startled arithmetic with breath. The ring unknotted. Righteousness denied its quarry, looked around for another story to tell, and chose, sensibly, the one in which neighbors do not shame themselves before dawn. People remembered their door bars and their beds, and the way ash finds a way into every fold of clothing. The watch counted heads with a shepherd's glance. The moon, embarrassed at having been used so thoroughly for theater, resumed being a moon. Marjorie stood with the bucket's handle biting her palm and felt the after tremor, the body's late understanding of how close a thing had come. She met Perkins' eye and saw there both fear and a kind of standing taller that he would never willingly admit to. He opened his mouth to boast or to cry. Boys choose between those two the way a coin chooses, and she forestalled both by handing him the empty bucket and saying, as if it were any afternoon, "Go fill it, and don't spill, and when you bring it back, we'll see if the bakehouse has any bread for fools who learn quickly." The knight, chastened but not done, drew back a pace. The town breathed together, a single animal with many lungs. Around them, water dripped from eaves with a sound that could almost be called patient. The bell was silent. The staff tapped once, not as alarm, but as punctuation. What remained, smoke, scorch, the smell of fear turning into a story, would be sorted by morning. For now, between the last gust of panic and the first hint of dawn, the lane held still, as if the darkness itself were listening to what it had made and was, for the first time that night, satisfied. Toward the 5th hour, the night loosened its grip. The bell rope hung motionless, tired of being a throat. Smoke thinned from sentences into smudges. A wet hush pressed the lane flat, as if even the cobbles had decided to lie still. Then the first, almost imaginary light arrived, the color of rinsed milk, finding the edges of buckets, the curve of a door latch, the dark gloss of soaked thatch. It wasn't yet morning. It was the idea of morning. People recognized it with the same relief they give a familiar footstep on the stair. Bodies came back to themselves. Men lowered shoulders they hadn't noticed were raised. Women brushed ash from sleeves and found it wouldn't quite leave. Children, wide-eyed and important, reported what everyone already knew. The watch moved more slowly, less a line of defense than a sweep of caretakers checking for last embers, last quarrels, last reasons to shout. Osbert's staff tapped once, as if to wake the street gently. "Bucket's back," he said, voice hoarse but almost affectionate. Ladders to hooks, names to doors. Marjorie stood beside her shop and felt the bucket's handle print her palm. The imprint would fade. The night would not. She tasted smoke and river and beeswax in the same breath, a city's recipe for survival. Across the lane, the bakehouse door had been propped wide, and heat pooled there like a small local sun. The baker's wife, hair pinned again, leaned in its glow with a stubborn, ordinary dignity. A pan came out, bearing a dozen small loaves, swept with ash and perfume. "Take one," she said to whoever passed, which was to say, we lived. People did, tearing careful halves, steam lifting like a benediction. Perkin drifted near, with a gait that wanted to be a swagger, and remembered, at the last moment, humility. A blister bloomed on his palm, like a medal he'd never seen before. Marjorie pressed a heel of bread into his hand, and another into his other hand, and watched him choose to keep only one. The second he offered, awkwardly, to the old man who had stood beside him in the chain. The old man pretended to be surprised, and then accepted with ceremony, as if the act had needed witnesses to be real. Behind them, a baby began to cry the long, healthy cry of a creature newly appointed to its lungs. The midwife's laugh followed, low and triumphant. For a heartbeat, the lane forgot ash and rumor, and turned toward that sound as if someone had pulled back a curtain. Even the smoke seemed to approve. Morning, not yet official, had made its case. The cooper's shed was done for, a black sketch against the paling sky. Staves lay collapsed like ribs. Men picked through the ruin, rescuing iron hoops with the care of farmers lifting snakes with sticks. Loss inventory is a civic right. Speak the damage aloud, divide it by neighbors, name what can be rebuilt, leave the rest to story. A few argued about causes, wind, negligence, omen, but their words were thin now, hunger-pocked and cooling on the air. Night breeds certainties, day asks for proofs. Osbert came to Marjorie's threshold, slower than he had come in alarm. His face had borrowed the color of the ash, but his eyes were ordinary again. "You were high on that roof," he said, neither praise nor scold. "Not as high as the moon," she said, and he almost smiled. He looked up at her eaves, where damp thatch darkened the wood. "That'll need a day in the sun," he said, making a promise he had no power to keep, but that daylight would keep for him. She lifted the bar, opened her door to a room that looked like a familiar place after a half-remembered dream. The little painted Mary above the bar wore a gray veil of soot, her pale mouth still listening. Marjorie wiped the figure with a damp rag, careful as if tending a fevered brow. "We did what we could," she told the room, which is another way of saying we did enough. She banked the embers into a neat red city and fed it with the smallest kindness of kindling. Flame agreed to live again. Outside, the lane performed mourning. Buckets nested and rose into tired arms. Ladders clacked against hooks. Doorways gathered neighbors for a few plain words and the quiet arithmetic of offers. A roof ladder for a roof, an hour's help for an afternoon's favor. Bread now, credit later. The town's manners, roughed overnight into urgency, returned in softer cloth. The gates, which had been rumors all dark long, became wood again. The wicket creaked. The porter coughed. A cart at last rolled in with a driver whose face declared he'd practiced his plea too late. And the sky, unimpressed by any of it, brightened. Not dramatically. Just enough that color bled back into the world. The blue in a tunic cuff, the brown of a dog's ear, the gold in the loaf a child held with two hands like a treasure. The river shrugged off its smoke and resumed being water with opinions. Birds, brave at last, practiced sentences. A cock, forgiven for his earlier confusion, asserted that now, finally, he had the right of it. Marjorie ate her own corner of bread, not because she was hungry. She would learn her hunger later, but because the act returned her to the order of things. She felt the square solidity of the shop behind her, the mild ache in her knees, the delicate sting where cinder had kissed her wrist. She felt, beneath the exhaustion, an ease that was not triumph and not indifference. It was simply the body's old gratitude for limits. Night ends. Tasks begin. People are as they are, which is to say, better than they fear and less than they boast. She looked for Perkin and found him carrying a broom, like a standard sweeping embers into a sorry parade. He caught her eye and rolled his shoulders as if they were suddenly too wide for his shirt. He would tell this night for years, trimming it for company. He would skip the parts where he was afraid and keep the part where a door gave way under his hands. She didn't begrudge him any of it. Stories are how towns remember where to place the ladders. In the Priory, a bell tried for lauds and found it. The note climbed, soft and sure, over houses that had been wise enough to remain. Marjorie's lips moved without urgency through a fragment of a psalm that, tonight, needed no request pinned to its tail. She did not ask to be spared. She did not bargain. She only agreed, quietly, with the world's stubborn argument that light returns. By the time the sun shook itself free of the roofline, the night had become marrow for talk. Words people would carry to market, to wells, to thresholds at noon. The fear, which had done its work, settled down like a tired animal and slept somewhere behind the hedges. Marjorie stood in her doorway a breath longer, watching smoke thin into sky and ash settle into the seams of the lane, and felt a calm that did not deny what had burned and did not worship it either. There would be replacing and repairing. There would be 2 extra candles for the Priory and a stricter way of setting the bar. There would be a boy with a blister and a story, a watchman with hoarseness and pride, a baker's wife with ash in her hair and generosity at her tongue. And there would be, this, most of all, another evening. Marjorie thought of that and was not afraid. Even the worst night, she knew now at the level of bone, has the decency to end. The light that found her hands this morning was not a miracle. It was a habit older than fear. She leaned on that habit, the way you lean on a doorframe you've passed 1,000 times, and the day received her, gently, as its own. Night has always been our oldest metaphor for the unproven. Before it was danger, it was simply what we could not name. A soft kingdom without borders where the mind supplied its own cartography. Place a human being in quiet and shade, and the imagination, dutiful and overeager, arrives with shapes. We do not fear darkness because it is empty. We fear it because it is available. It lets uncertainty try on bodies. A footfall becomes intent. A draft becomes presence. A silence becomes a verdict. In that sense, night is not the opposite of day. It is the opposite of certainty. It asks, gently and insistently, what do you believe when seeing pauses? Across centuries, the answer has been a choreography of small lights and shared rules. We learn to tame darkness not by defeating it, but by negotiating with it. First came flame, handheld sun, stubborn and persuasive, teaching us that even a thimble of brightness can organize a room. Then came custom, the bar across the door, the bucket by the hearth, the names of neighbors spoken aloud so rumor would not have the only voice. Later, we raised lanterns in streets and numbered the hours. Later still, we wired stars to switches and called it progress. Each invention was less a conquest than a promise that the unknown could be measured, portioned, invited to keep its distance. Yet we never dismissed the night entirely because we needed what it taught. In darkness, hearing becomes honest. Caution becomes a craft rather than a posture. Communities discover themselves after sunset, the watch-tapping stone, the quiet agreement that one house listens while another sleeps. Even our stories, those portable shelters, were built at the edge of lamp circles, tales that introduced names to noises so that fear would have to pass through language before it could touch the door. Modern light is generous, but it has not retired the symbol. We still keep a lamp on a porch, not only for keys, but for courage. We still read the sky, for weather and meaning. Still feel the old tug in a hallway where the bulb flickers. The lesson is not that darkness vanishes. It is that we become articulate inside it. A single candle on a table does not push night away. It teaches the eyes what to love first. A ritual, lock checked, window latched, message sent, does not abolish uncertainty. It reminds the heart that uncertainty can be lived with. So night remains a teacher with patient manners. It asks us to make company with limits, to trade spectacle for attention, to let small certainties do their work. And against it, we place not bravado, but companionship, neighbors, watchmen, midwives, the quiet industry of hands. That is how humanity learned to tame the dark, not by erasing it, but by becoming brighter together than any one of us could be alone. Across eras, night keeps the same appointment with us. It arrives on schedule, measures our courage, and leaves its report with the morning. Pharaohs read it in star rows. Monks kept it with bells. Sailors parsed it by a lantern swinging from a mast. Frontier porches, city stoops, desert tents. The setting changes, the test does not. Darkness presses close and asks the oldest question. What do you trust when the world withholds its outlines? Our answers, small fires, shared rules, names spoken into the quiet, belong to every century, stand far enough back, and human history looks like a long conversation between shadow and flame. We learn to stack embers into hearths, to walk with torches, to hang lamps in streets, to spark filaments and wake whole skylines at a switch. Each step is less a triumph over night than a pact with it. We will meet you with a little light and a little company. Night, for its part, keeps granting us the same lesson in return, that fear shrinks when distributed among neighbors, and that attention, not bravado, is the better shield. The constellations help. They are history that never closes. The same scatter a mason in York saw after Compline, a shepherd on a Judean hill, a traveler pulling off the interstate to stretch his legs in the cool. Stars are night's admission that it is not empty but studded with distances. Even a clouded sky remembers them, and behind the clouds, the larger pattern holds. Shadow is parasitic. It has no source of its own. It borrows from light and yields to it without argument. So the lesson that felt local, one house, one candle, one watchman's tap, belongs to the forever things. Darkness abides near us. We are never rid of it, and we do not need to be. It sharpens hearing, rewards prudence, invites fellowship. But when light arrives, lamp or dawn, or the calm that follows panic, it does not negotiate. It simply makes visible what was already there. The bucket by the hearth, the ladder on its hook, the neighbor who has quietly been awake for your sake. This is why even the worst nights conclude in a familiar grammar. Smoke thinning to morning, birds mispronouncing the first notes, bread breaking into steam. The world remembers how to be seen. We remember how to live in it. Night will return and test us again, as it always has. We will answer with flame and order, as we always do. And in that recurring exchange, shadow advancing, light replying, something steady holds. The assurance that what is patient and bright does not need to hurry to prevail. Dawn does not arrive. It gathers. First as a pale seam at the far fields, then as a faint silver laid along the rooftops, then as a quieting of shadows until they seem to lie down of their own accord. The bell rope hangs still, damp with smoke, as if it too were listening for the new color in the air. From the river comes a breath that smells of cold stone and distance. It moves through the lanes and under doors, lifts the edge of a shutter, touches a bowl left to cool. The town accepts it the way a sleeper accepts a blanket pulled back to the shoulders. Above the market, thatch dark with last night's water takes on a shy sheen. A thread of smoke escapes a repaired roof and twists blue in the mild, forgiving light. Windows blink into themselves. No lanterns, only the day working its slow arithmetic on glass. On the priory wall, a swallow sketches practice loops, stitching sky to courtyard. The watchman, coat unbuttoned now, leans his staff and rubs his eyes with a hand that smells of wet ash and oak. He has counted enough. The hours can count themselves. From the bakehouse, a door opens on a hush that is warmer than silence. Bread shows its gold, thin steam lifting like a soft vow. The baker's wife sets the loaves on boards as though arranging small suns. Someone laughs, not loudly, and the sound carries farther than laughter needs to. In the lane, Perkin drags a broom in thoughtful arcs, drawing pale crescent moons in ash. He is careful not to scatter what the night has settled. He is careful, too, not to worship it. The midwife passes, a scrap of song at her mouth, and the song leaves a brightness in the wake that is not quite music and not quite memory. Marjorie stands in her doorway, palms marked by the bucket handle, sleeve mended quickly where the ember kissed it. The little painted Mary above her bar has been wiped clean. She shines in the ordinary way wood shines when someone has cared for it. Marjorie watches the light discover the lane, the nicked doorframe, the bucket's dent, the ladder's calm shadow, and feels how daylight names things without argument. Where night was a list of questions, morning is a ledger of facts. This is spared, this is lost, this can be repaired. She lets the difference enter her like warmth. A drowsy cock, late but proud, explains the hour to anyone who needs telling. Pigeons agree without conviction. Somewhere, a cart clacks over a board laid across a gutter. The sound is simple, civic, unafraid. The gate's wicket opens and shuts with the honesty of wood. Far above all this, the sky clears to a clean, rinsed blue, streaked with pale cloud like stretching linen. The moon, thin and excused, slips quietly away, a guest who knows how to leave. Last night's fear remains, but it has changed neighborhoods. It lives now in footprints on the wet cobbles, in the black tooth of a fallen beam, in the story the baker's wife will tell with soot still under her nails. Fear shrinks in light the way ink thins in water. It doesn't vanish so much as reveal what it was clinging to. You can see the shape of it now, and because you can see the shape, you can put it down. The town resumes its mild habits. Latches lift and do not startle. A bucket is set where a hand will expect it tonight. A neighbor, passing, touches the doorframe the way one touches the shoulder of a friend who has been through something. Osbert's staff taps once. Punctuation, not alarm, and he smiles at nothing in particular, which is to say, at everything that still stands. Light pools softly in the hollows, in a stairwell, under a cart, along the river stair. It does not boast. It does what light does, makes a grammar of edges, gives back distance, allows the ordinary to be itself. The town reads itself in this script and finds the lines familiar. A baby answers with a new, unembarrassed cry, and the sound places a pin in the map of the morning. There will be another evening. There always is. The bar will be set, the ember banked, the watchman's route learned again by his feet. Night will bring its old syllabus of footsteps and drafts. But here, in this hour when roofs are silvered and breath no longer smudges the air. The bargain feels fair. Darkness is near. It is not in charge. What it asked has been answered, for now, with ladders and buckets, with names spoken aloud, with bread passed hand to hand. The fear that prowled the eaves lies quiet in the straw. So the day opens, not with a flourish, but with a steadying hand. It lays itself over Marjorie's street, and over every street like it, then and now, and says what dawn always says without words. Continue. And the town does, gently, deliberately, accepting the lesson the night was trying to teach and the one the morning completes. That light does not argue. It arrives, and in arriving, it makes room for courage to rest. In the end, the medieval night was a kind of furnace, close, breathless, licking at roofs, tempering courage, warping rumor, smelting fear into something a town could hold. It felt like a private hell with public hours, curfew as the gate to an underworld, door bars as small iron prayers, watchmen as lean saints against chaos, yet the furnace always opened, and morning poured out, steam from bread, water dripping from eaves, the tired laughter that sounds like forgiveness. Night burned, yes, but it also refined. And when it had finished with us, we stepped out altered, ash on our sleeves, steadiness in our hands. We carry that old metallurgy into our own evenings. Porch bulbs, camera bells, the mild chorus of late buses, our version of watch and ward. We still inventory the dark by touch. A lock checked, a message sent, a neighbor's window lit. Panic still rehearses its arguments. Light still answers without debate. What the lane learned, the avenue remembers. Hell has hours, and they end. Here, let us pause, gently, between centuries. І так само, як колись середньовічні люди дочекалися світанку, ми сьогодні знаємо, жодна темрява не триває вічно. And just as medieval people once waited for dawn, we know today, no darkness lasts forever. So we leave Marjorie at her threshold, palm faintly branded by a bucket's handle, sleeve neatly mended where an ember tried its luck. We leave Osbert with a hoarse voice and a staff that this time was enough. We leave Perkin practicing a taller walk he hasn't yet earned and will someday deserve. We leave the baker's wife arranging loaves like small sons, and the little Mary above the bar listening, as ever, without hurry. The lane keeps its modest treasure, a ladder on a hook, a bucket where a hand expects it, a habit of calling names into a worrisome quiet until the quiet gives back a name. The town exhales. Chimneys write their pale scripts. Birds negotiate the first sentence of the day. Fear does what fear always does when faced with daylight. It remembers its manners and becomes memory. The gate's wicket opens with the old wooden honesty, and the river resumes being only water with opinions. Across the roofs, light lifts like a careful hand, blessing what endured, warming what can be mended, making visible the few things that must be grieved. We turn from the lane to our own streets, carrying the lesson that learned us. That night may stage its pageant, footsteps, drafts, tall stories, and still be spoken to with ladders, buckets, neighborly knocks, and bread shared while it's hot. The dark is not dethroned. It is negotiated with. The bargain is ancient and fair. We hold our portion, small flames, common rules, patience and company. Farewell, then, to the hour when doors listen and roofs mutter to the curfewed underworld that never claimed the morning. Farewell to the watch's tap, the mill stream's count, the room that made a ship out of a single candle. Let the bell hang quiet. Let the smoke thin to sky. Let Marjorie's street, like yours, like mine, return to its daytime grammar, where edges are kind and tasks are eloquent. And if tonight the old furnace glows again, we know the shape of the work. We will bank the ember, set the bar true, call our names across the room, and wait together. Dawn will gather, as it always has, soft and sufficient. Night will have said its piece. Morning will have the last word.